Good day, everyone, and welcome to this online event titled Geographical Information Systems, Practical Applications for Sustainable Natural Resource Management. My name is Mariana Vidal Merino, and I will be the facilitator of today's event. GIS and remote sensing play a strategic role in helping societies address complex environmental and social challenges, such as biodiversity loss, deforestation, land degradation, climate-related risk, and climate change vulnerability. The development of open source tools and freely available satellite imagery has enabled citizens worldwide to integrate and combine information layers for multiple themes and locations, to simultaneously explore relationships across multiple complex issues in order to enable a deeper understanding of them. As such, GIS and remote sensing methods and tools hold the potential to contribute to monitoring and implementing global agreements, including the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement, the post-2020 Biodiversity Framework, which is currently under preparation, and the Sendai Framework for Disaster Management. Today, we have the honor of presenting you three remarkable speakers, all applying GIS tools in different ways and for different purposes in the realm of natural resource management. The objective of this webinar is to provide practical insights about what are the potential applications GIS can have. This event is part of the ongoing training on project monitoring and reporting using open source tools, which is a DAAD-funded 5 weeks online training. We organize these trainings once per year. So if you're interested in applying, we will share the call for the next course in 2022 on our social media. This webinar is co-organized by BluoVerda and Weltweit. I am a member and a co-founder of BluoVerda. We are a non-profit organization that designs and implements sustainable management of natural resources and nature conservation projects in Latin America. We do this by empowering local communities, building local capacities, fostering innovation, and connecting actors across the globe. We are always looking for inspired people that want to join forces with us to fight deforestation, forest degradation, biodiversity loss, and climate change. So if these goals resonate with you and you want to contribute and take actions, please connect with us and we will be happy to sit with you and discuss your ideas. And before presenting the agenda for today, I would like to give the floor to Dori, who is here today representing Weltweit, and also has some welcoming words for you. Dori, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mariana. Hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to join this event today. My name is Dori Estrada, and I'm the Vice President of Weltweit e.V., which is an NGO focusing on the promotion of local initiatives. Our organization has had the pleasure of partnering with BluoVerda on this GIS workshop a couple times now. And I would say the mission of both organizations is in line with the overall greater picture of sustainable development. Weltweit's angle at this is that we support small initiatives in developing countries and even some in Germany where we're based that are really led by the best experts who could lead them, which is the graduates who come with technical knowledge in various aspects of sustainable development from those places. We truly believe that the most sustainable projects are the ones that are implemented by people who know the problems best. We also run an annual project management academy consisting of several tools for running your own project. We have this usually twice a year, and I will put our link in the chat for anyone who's interested in having more information about that. But the tool specifically of GIS is, as Mariana said, a wonderful open source methodology for collecting and monitoring very, very critical data to solve some of these pressing environmental problems she spoke about. So it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you so much. I'm really happy to answer any questions regarding Weltweit. You can always reach out to me and I will put our link in the chat. Thanks, guys.
Thanks a lot, Tori, and for your words. And just to briefly mention that today, as I already said, we have three exciting inputs. I hope you enjoy them. I know that I'm personally really much looking forward to hearing their presentations. So following the three presentations, there will be a space for question and answers. So if you have any questions, please feel free to write them on the chat box on Zoom, and we will collect them for the Q&A session. And let's get right into our first presentation. As our first speaker, we have Mateo Jaimes. Mateo is a biologist from Colombia, and he has a background in botany and has worked in different conservation projects in the tropical dry forest, cloud forest, and the Amazon rainforest. Mateo's interest in biodiversity conservation led him to do a master's degree in sustainable tropical forestry at Bangor University in UK and at the TU Dresden in Germany, where he developed a Landcover classification that he will be presenting today. We are also especially proud to have him as a speaker today because Mateo is an alumni of our training on project monitoring and reporting using open source tools. And also he has done his research as part of one of our projects. So it is an honor to have him here today. Mateo, you're welcome, and I hand it over to you for your presentation.
Hello, everyone. And first of all, I want to thank BluoVerda and Vidalt for the invitation to this webinar. As Mariana was telling you, I was an alumni of the last year of this course that you have. And because of this, I decided to make this for my master thesis. So I'm gonna speak about the Landcover mapping that I made in Peru, in Madre de Dios. Landcover mapping with Sentinel-2 images and field data through random forest classification. Okay, so this is the content of my presentation. First, an introduction, the objectives, the methods, the findings, and finally the conclusions. So, forests cover 31% of the global land area, and those forests provide different ecosystem services for humans, including food, raw materials, water, as well as regulating the climate and carbon flux across the globe. In addition, forests are biologically diverse systems. They offer a variety of habitats for plants, animals, and microorganisms. Peru is one of the 10 countries with more forest cover in the world, and Madre de Dios is considered a hotspot of biodiversity. Nevertheless, this hotspot and these forests are threatened by deforestation. Since the beginning of the 90s, almost 4 million of hectares has been lost in the world. And from 2000 to 2020, Peru lost almost 2.1 million of hectares of primary forest. And Madre de Dios, the hotspot of biodiversity, is the 5th region in Peru in deforestation. This is due to the gold mining, agriculture, cattle ranching, urban development, and legal and illegal logging. You can see in the bottom that the figure how the increasing in tree cover loss in Madre de Dios since the 2000 years. So the government of Peru launched the GeoBosques platform. That is a platform that that shows the forest, the loss of the forest in different years, and in addition has a module of early warning alerts of deforestation. Nevertheless, this system worked for a regional scale, but a small reserve and communities need some more local approach to monitor this program, their forest. So that's why BluoVerda, in close collaboration with RBO Peru, launched this project, as was near real-time forest monitoring of local protected areas in the Amazon region. The aim of this project was to build a deforestation detection system based on satellite images in the reserve managed by RBO Amazonia and the surrounded areas. This with open source software and free access data. And as the first step to develop this local monitoring system, the aim of my project was to make a Landcover classification. So the main question for me was, what is the current state of conservation of RBO concession and in the surrounded areas in terms of the percentage of the different vegetation and Landcover types? And to answer this question, I tried to generate a Landcover classification model based on free satellite image and free and field data through the machine learning algorithm. Then I assess the accuracy. Always you have to assess the accuracy of the model that you create. And finally, I try to generate a map of the different cover types in the field, utilizing the classification of time. So the RBO concession of the RBO reserve is located in the southeast part of Peru, in the Amazon region. To reach this place, you have to take a car from the capital of Madre de Dios, that is Puerto Maldonado, 2 hours, and then I reached Puerto Lucerna, and from Puerto Lucerna you have to take a boat that is 2 hours to the reserve, and you have to and you reach finally after 5 or 6 hours to the reserve. So it's a kind of a faraway place. This is characterized by a humid to subhumid tropical weather. So to know what were the land cover types, we made a first classification through the Google Earth, and we identified some land cover types, and then we went to the place to the reserve, and we looked for these cover types, and it's near to the edge of the rivers. Secondary forest, that are forests after the deforestation processes or after crops, and finally water, just water bodies. Then we made a data collection. So we decided to use these Sentinel-2 images because the spatial, radiometric, and spectral and temporal resolution was better than the Landsat used by the GeoBosques, and because they offer different bands, so this has an advantage against Landsat 7 and 8. And we as well use the software Snap and Qgis. Both of softwares are free, and Snap is created just for work with Sentinel-2 images. So it has a lot of tools just for work with the Sentinel-2 images. Then we follow a change of processes that you always have to follow to work with the Sentinel-2 images, with Sentinel images. But in addition, we work with a DM model that is an elevation model, and we use 4 different vegetation indexes, and we put this into the model to then make the random forest classification. Then we create this map that is the final map of the class of the land cover types, and we found that the most of the areas are covered by forest, followed by the secondary forest, then water, and then the secondary forest. So then to answer the questions, we find that 80% of the forest and secondary forest, sorry, so 85% of the conservation area is forest, showing the good conservation level of the area. And to generate a land cover classification model based on free satellite images, we found that the Sentinel 2 images are super good for this task. And we found as well that the importance of the field data, because there was some points that was impossible to find, to know what was in there by just satellite images like Google Earth. But when we went there and we see the differences between the vegetation and between the cohorts, we found that this was a different, of course, cohort type. And then the accuracy that we found was super high, was 90.2.8, and the most important variables in our model was the DM, the model of elevation, and one of the indexes that we use. And for generate a map, the map produced could be used for the authorities and communities for conservancy processes. And for conclusions, we found that the good state of conservation and of RBO and the surrounded areas, but as well we found that there is some parts of secondary forest and crops that are cause of concern. And we of course highlight the importance of the in situ data collection for land cover classifications, as well as the ancillary data, that is the DM and the vegetation indexes, and well, that the map can be used for land use planning, as well for prioritize areas for reforestation and conservation. And we use all these processes. We made a workshop for the persons of the RBO concession, and they made their own classification with the same process. So this means that this process, these images and this software can be used by whatever person, and not just for a researcher, but for a person that is in the reserve. And of course, we have some difficulties. The accessibility to some places was super difficult, and sometimes the communities doesn't give us permission to enter to some places. And for the recommendations, of course, always is important to have more training data and more sparse points, and make the agreements with the local communities, so they give us always the permission to enter to the places. And this is the references. Thank you. Sorry for the inconvenience with the sound. Sorry.
Thanks so much, Mateo, for the presentation. And it was not a problem at the end. We could hear you well, so it worked fine. I will suggest to make a slight change of plans, because there are some questions on the chat that I think if we leave it to the end, maybe they would get out of context. So okay. I will take the liberty to ask 2 or 3 questions to you now, if that's okay, Mateo.
Yeah, nice. Perfect.
Yeah, so I have a question from Lucia here, and she asked, which bands did you use? And
All the bands.
why is it good to have more?
Why what?
Why is it good to have more bands and in comparison to using few of them?
Okay.
Sorry,
Well,
can I speak? Sorry, I will interrupt. That was my question, and it's not what I asked. What she read. Sorry, so I will specify. My question was: could you explain to people who are not so familiar what are bands? Like, what is it important? Why is it important to have more bands? What is that? Thanks.
Okay. So so the bands are like the images are composed by bands. So each band has different
wavelength.
Sorry.
Each band has
wavelength.
Wavelength.
Wavelengths.
So,
Yeah. Sorry for the name. I'm not an expert in Qgis. This was my first job, but okay, yes. Each one has different wavelengths. So if you have more wavelengths, if you have more bands, the wavelengths are like it's like has if you have a rule and you divide this rule, this spectral spectrometric image in different bands. Every band has different information. If you have more bands, you have more information to work with this to define different things in the image. But no, I cannot answer well this question to you. Sorry, Lucia.
Can I add to your
yeah, please. Sorry.
So of course the bands of when these data are collected from satellites, for example, Sentinel 2 is one of the European satellites, right? So the satellite, it reflects the Earth, the satellite reflects the Earth, and it uses these wavelengths, to be able to determine some certain spectral characteristics. So each of these wavelengths, right? Each of these bands, there are different information that your machine learning is going to use to be able to classify your land cover types. You understand? So the more of these characteristics, the better your machine learning is going to work on the data, right? So examples of the bands are something like we have the near infrared, we have as in near infrared bands, and so other many kind of bands, okay, and they have different functions, right? So more of this band, I think, from what he has presented, will give us more information, more spectral and information that the algorithm, the machine learning algorithm, random forest will work with to be able to classify these land cover types to make maybe better predictions or better accuracy when they assess it. So this is, I think this is just a layman kind of explanation I'm explaining, right? Yeah, so.
Yes, perfect. Thanks so much for complimenting that.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And I have one last question before going to the next presentation, and that is from Kien Pam. And the question is, will you consider to automate the classification process so that
yes,
data could be updated timely?
Yes, you can automatize, and yeah, this is ideal. This is the idea to automatize. There is plenty of things. Even in the Snap, you can automatize all the process, and you just download the image, and you just put the image in a change that you create, and all the process is made automatically. So yeah, it's good. It's kind of good, but sometimes the program gets stuck with something. But yeah, of course, it's good to automatize these processes, and you can make it by Qgis, by Snap, by a lot of programs, even by R or by Google Engine. There is a lot of.
Okay, thanks so much. Due to time, I will leave the rest of the questions for the Q&A session. But thanks again, Mateo. And let me just briefly share my screen and present our next speaker. So now we welcome Virginia Valenti. Virginia comes originally from Italy and recently finished her studies at the Maastricht University. So congratulations for that, Virginia. And as part of her study, she focused on climate change adaptation and disaster risk management in the Middle East and the Arab world. We will hear more about how she integrates GIS tools into her research. So without further ado, Virginia, please, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the welcome and thank you for having me. I hope everyone can hear me. Let me share my screen so we can get started. Okay. So go on. Right. Okay. So the title of the presentation is Vulnerable and Exposed Drought Risk Assessment of the Agriculture Sector in Iraq. And this is the research that I conducted for my master thesis. A quick rundown of what we'll talk about there. I'll introduce the Iraqi context a little bit to you and explain the research question and some of the background for the research. And then we'll quickly go through the methodology and the results, discuss drought risk more holistically. And if I have time, I'll run through some limitations and then the conclusions at the end. So quickly, the reason why I decided to do this study in the first place is because recent studies that kind of stemmed from the IPCC, a report that was published in 2014, concluded that the Middle East in general as a region is going to suffer from increasingly high temperatures and heat waves, decreased precipitation, and as a result, more frequent droughts, which is going to have, I mean, the Middle East is already, as is, a very water scarce region, but increasing drought events are going to have large scale impacts on human systems that are reliant on things like agriculture or, just in general, water for life. And so because of these impacts that are going to be felt in the future, there is a need for research to focus on climate change impacts in the region. And I decided to focus on Iraq, particularly because these impacts are already beginning to be felt in Iraq. So there was we'll talk about more about this later, but there was a very, very severe drought event in 2008 that had very far reaching impacts on food supply, food security, and malnutrition in the country as a whole. So I decided to focus on Iraq specifically. A little bit more about Iraq. Obviously, it's a country located in the Middle East. It's a federal republic, which means that the northernmost governorates up here, the ones bordered in green, form the Kurdistan Regional Government, which is an autonomous region. As some of you may know, in the last 40 to 50 years, Iraq has suffered some very serious wars that have had large-scale impacts on its socioeconomic structure in general. The most recent of these wars was the 2014 formation of ISIS, and then the war that followed to sort of disintegrate the Islamic State that has destroyed land and infrastructure all across the country. The economy of Iraq is dominated by the oil sector. It has not diversified a lot in the last 4 decades, largely because of conflict. But agriculture accounts for 8.4% of the country's non-oil GDP, which is pretty important. It is also the third largest employer in the country as a whole and the largest employer in rural areas, which means that a lot of people that live in the countryside rely on agriculture for income and for food, because a lot of the farms in Iraq are small and family run, which means that, there is no large scale corporate farming. So a lot of people really do depend on this for their livelihood. But this sector is going to suffer from droughts with increasing frequency in the future. And what exactly is a drought? The World Meteorological Organization this defines it as a prolonged dry period in the natural climate cycle, which basically just means that decreased precipitation or increased evapotranspiration from the ground lead to less water in rivers and groundwater resources, in lakes, in streams, which then have impacts on soil moisture, making agriculture more difficult, which in turn then has effects on the population because people don't have water to drink, they don't have water to cook with, they don't have water to shower, and they don't have water to irrigate their crops. So the fact droughts have severe impacts on both natural and human systems, which is why they need to be studied very holistically. And they're also very difficult to measure properly. So the research question of the study was to try and determine the extent to which Iraq's agriculture sector is at risk of droughts. This was kind of the driving research question. And to answer this question, I applied the IPCC risk framework. Some of you may be familiar with this figure. It gets quoted a lot. But it basically, the IPCC's argument was that risk to natural disasters, so to speak, shouldn't only be looked at from a natural perspective, because natural disasters don't only have natural impacts, nor do they only have natural causes, right? So you need to include the human aspect in analysis, which is why you need to study the hazard. Yes, you need to be able to determine how frequently an area is exposed to a hazard like droughts, but you also need to be able to say what happens in those areas that are most exposed to droughts, right? So if droughts happen in an area where no one lives and there is no agriculture, that's not as impactful as droughts happening in an area where there is a large city or where there is a lot of agriculture. Similarly, you need to be able to tell whether people are vulnerable to droughts in those areas. Are the people that live there poor? Are they reliant on agriculture for their food? Are they illiterate and therefore less likely to be able to diversify their income in case of a drought? So these three elements are what composes risk to droughts. And all of these three elements are what I tried to analyze using satellite imagery and socioeconomic data, as I will show you now. So I apologize if this gets a little technical. I'm trying to keep it as simple as possible. But so for the hazard part, so trying to determine how frequently droughts happen in Iraq, I applied UN Spider's recommended practices for drought monitoring. UN Spider is a UN agency that specializes in using satellite imagery to do hazard monitoring. And they recommend using something called the Vegetation Condition Index, which is something that, using those famed bands that we were just talking about, you can measure whether vegetation is healthy or not, depending on how green it is, which is something that you can determine from space using satellite imagery. So you take this raster data, which they suggest using MODIS data. MODIS is a sensor operated by NASA that has a temporal resolution of 16 days and a spatial resolution of 250 meters. And using this raster data, you compute VCI values. VCI is in Vegetation Condition Index. In my case, the VCI values were from 2001 to 2020. And what I did with this raster data was calculate yearly average values and then reclassify them according to drought severity classes, which say that, for example, if there is a VCI value below 40, a drought is happening. If that VCI value is below 10, it means that there is an extreme drought happening. So the result was these 20 maps that show the yearly average VCI value for example, 2001, but 2008 here, or 2020. As you can see, and I'd mentioned this previously, 2008 was a very, very bad drought year for the northern parts of Iraq. You can see here the red indicates that there was an extreme drought going on that started in 2008 and went on until about 2010. This is in line with literature that says this, and that talks about how the agriculture sector in the entire country was very badly affected by this. But just like looking at this big picture, you can see that pretty much the entire country has been exposed to some form of drought at any point in this time frame, except for 2019, which was an extremely wet year where no drought took place, according to VCI values. If you then aggregate this, so you put all of these raster files together, you can calculate on average how many times each governorate within Iraq experienced drought in that 20-year time window. So you can see that the governorates in the northeastern part of the country experienced drought most frequently. Al-Anbar, Ninawa, and Salahuddin were most exposed. And then southern governorates, southern central governorates were the second most exposed. And the Kurdish governorates, so the governorates that are a part of the KRG, were least exposed to drought of any classification, because you see here that I kept the VCI values below 40. So then moving on to the exposure analysis part, this was done, there was sort of a two-pronged approach, one involving satellite imagery and one involving just normal statistics. The satellite imagery was used to determine where there actually is agricultural land in Iraq. So I used, the European Space Agency has a Landcover time series that has a spatial resolution of 300 meters and is freely available, which is why I ended up using it. I had to reclassify the raster values so that only agricultural land, water bodies, and urban areas were included. And then I merged that with the VCI raster files to determine what agricultural area is exposed to the different drought severity classes, but we'll see these later. And then the second pronged part of the approach was using crop statistics to figure out what governorates grow the most amount of crops, because obviously if a drought happens in a governorate that doesn't really have a lot of crop production, it's less impactful to the food chain than it happening somewhere else. So this is concentration of cropland in Iraq. This is what I derived from the Landcover time series. You can see that there is a lot of agriculture in the northern states, so the Kurdish governorates. This is all rain-fed agriculture for the most part, whereas in the more southern central governorates, there's also a lot of agriculture, but it's irrigated. So they take water from the Tigris and the Euphrates, which are two very, very big rivers in Iraq, and they use those waters to irrigate crops. Then putting this together with the VCI analysis from earlier, you can see that pretty much the entire agriculture system of Iraq is exposed to mild and moderate droughts. There's no real, if you look at these maps and then you go back and look at this one, there's no real difference between the entire system is exposed. If you then talk about severe and extreme droughts, less cropland is exposed. But if you look here, the northern governorates are exposed to extreme drought. And this is relevant because when you look at crop production statistics, you can see that Nineveh and the Kurdish governorates are some of the most crop producing governorates in Iraq. So a drought happening in Nineveh is going to obviously be a really big problem when compared to a drought that's happening in, for example, Muthanya down here, because more crops are grown in Nineveh than down south. Nineveh is actually the biggest crop producer by far because they grow virtually like all of Iraq's grains. So then moving on to the vulnerability analysis, sorry, I'm trying to keep this quick because I'm conscious of time. This involved no satellite imagery no QGIS until the very end. But I collected socioeconomic data from a bunch of different governmental, international, and INGO resources, and put it together to try and determine where people are most vulnerable. I wanted to keep it at the governorate level to make the analysis more specific, which proved to be a challenge because it meant that information wasn't as freely available. I actually had to exclude Nineveh from the analysis because that's where ISIS first emerged in 2014, and the governorate has been deemed very unsafe, too unsafe to conduct research since 2014. So there's no recent statistics on the governorate, but because ISIS was such a drastic event that occurred in the country, including Nineveh in the analysis with pre-ISIS statistics would have skewed the entire analysis because it would have turned out to be not as vulnerable as it actually is. So then anyways, the data was then normalized and aggregated into a vulnerability index using principal component analysis. And finally, I merged that with a shapefile of Iraq's geometry to get this map, which shows, it shows the vulnerability index. You can see that Nineveh is missing, which is why it's white. And Al-Anbar is by far an outlier. It's the most vulnerable governorate by a lot. And this is because one of the indicators that I included in the analysis is damages, like estimated damages done by ISIS. And Al-Anbar specifically was very, very badly hit by ISIS. It was occupied by the Islamic State for a long time. And so the entire infrastructure system has just been destroyed. Which is why Al Anbar is an outlier. Had Nineveh been included, it probably would have also been equally as vulnerable. Quickly, the reason why Al Basra is also highly vulnerable when compared to its neighbors is because the health outcomes in the state, in the governorate, are very, very poor. Al Basra has had a water quality crisis that's been ongoing for 3 or 4 years now, and that has led to, you know, bad health outcomes, high malnutrition. They also don't really have a lot of hospitals and not a lot of doctors. And these are all things that were included in the vulnerability analysis as well. So to kind of bring it all together, and I apologize, Stephanie, for cutting out the sources in these maps. They needed to all fit in a slide, but if you make maps, please include your sources. So just to try and bring it all together, right? You have here how prone governorates are to droughts in the map in the top right. In the top left, you have how much crops are grown in each governorate. And then in the bottom, you have the vulnerability index. If you do a quick visual comparison, you can see that Nineveh is very, very prone to droughts. It grows a lot of crops, and sort of extrapolating is also very vulnerable. Its population is very vulnerable to droughts. Should a drought happen in Nineveh, it would have very, very drastic consequences for its population, but also for the entire country, because it's where most of Iraq's grains are grown. Similarly, you can say that if a drought were to happen in Al Muthanya, for example, which is fairly prone to drought, is not very important agriculture-wise, but is fairly vulnerable, the impacts would be less drastic, but still very bad. For people in Al Muthanya, it would have less far-reaching impacts for the entire country, for example. I don't have time to go through limitations, but if you want to know about them, please ask me, because there were a few. No study is perfect. So in conclusion, the aim of the study was to determine whether Iraq's agriculture sector is at risk of droughts. The answer to that question is that yes, the agriculture sector is very at risk of droughts. Specifically, it's exposed to mild and moderate droughts. The population in general is very vulnerable. Al Anbar was an outlier, but the standard deviation for all of the other governorates is not very big at all, which means that they're all basically equally as vulnerable to each other. And the northwestern part of the country, which is where most of the crops are grown, is particularly exposed to extreme and severe droughts, which means that should a drought take place, the food chain and food supply of the entire country could be compromised. So yeah, pretty grim outlook. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks so much, Virginia, for the excellent presentation. Following what I did with Mateo, I have 2 or 3 questions that I will do now, and the rest I will leave for the Q&A session.
Sounds good.
I will ask you to be as brief as possible for the sake of time. The first question is from Lucia, and she asked, how does the VCI consider natural variations of greenness between species or times of the year?
That's a good question. So the VCI was specifically formulated to account for those variations that you talk about. It was formulated after people realized that the NDVI was particularly sensitive to, I'm forgetting my terminology now, to canopy exposure. Basically, it had a hard time differentiating between shrubs and dense vegetation, essentially. Obviously, this is not particularly relevant in the case of Iraq because there is no dense forest. It's basically all shrubs or desert. But within the formula of the VCI, which, to be honest with you, I cannot recite from memory, there are coefficients and data that account for natural variations in greenness, so that you don't just assume that there is a drought happening just because it's the middle of summer and there isn't a lot of naturally occurring water in the system.
Thank you, Virginia. I hope that answered the question of Lucia, and I will go with the next one from John Waweru, and he asked, what was the justification for using VCI as opposed to other drought indexes such as SPI?
Good question. Honestly, that the VCI is more easy to calculate when you don't have a lot of processing power is the answer. I mean, it was recommended by UN Spider and I considered using SPI, but it would have been difficult to run it at a resolution small enough to make conclusions at the governorate level, given that I'm working on my own laptop and not on, you know, a desktop with high RAM and just more processing power in general. I did run SPI analysis using Google Earth Engine as part of the thesis, but the results were kind of inconclusive because I didn't really have a lot of time to run it properly. So I decided not to include it in this presentation. But yeah, it was mostly a processing power issue, and the fact that I could just download satellite information, chuck it all in QGIS and have NR and have the VCI be spat out automatically.
Great, perfect, thank you. And the last question before we go to the next presentation is from Kien Pan. And he asks, which data products from MODIS did you select to calculate the VCI? Monthly average or yearly?
So it's actually neither. It's the name of the product is Mod 13Q1, and it has a 16-day spatial resolution. So MODIS, the Aqua and Terra satellites orbit over Iraq every 16 days. So the product itself actually has, I forget how many pictures per year, but it basically, because it orbits over Iraq every 16 days, for every year you get a certain amount of pictures that correspond to that orbit cycle. And then I put them together to calculate yearly averages. But the product itself was just for that specific day, which to be honest with you, I think it might've been something around like 30 to 40 images per year. I don't remember off the top of my head, but I did the calculating of the yearly averages that wasn't already included in the product.
Yeah, that's already an impressive memory. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Great. So we will go straight to the next presentation. If you have questions, don't worry. We are taking notes of them and they will be asked at the end. But for now, it is my pleasure to present not one, but two presenters. And the first one that I will present is Mr. Assefa Wosnie, who is an aquatic ecologist at Tila University in Ethiopia. Assefa has a bachelor in biology, a master's in zoological science, and a PhD in fisheries and aquatic sciences. His current research includes freshwater ecology and wetlands, and their role in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Currently, he is a postdoc fellow at the University of Bonn with the SDG Fellowship Program. And last but not least, welcome to Miguel Alvarez. Miguel is a vegetation ecologist at the University of Bonn. He has a background on agronomy, a bachelor on plant production, and a PhD on geobotany. His current research includes plant invasion and wetland ecology. He is also maintaining vegetation plot databases for Africa and South America, and developing packages for the statistical assessment of such as R. Assefa, Miguel, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you for having us. Our presentation is more of on the basics, and we said the title as No Survey Without GPS. In the case of our studies, environmental studies and vegetation surveys in the Great Rift Valley region, is a joint presentation between me, Assefa Wosnie, and my colleague Miguel Alvarez. And here the picture is taken during our survey in the Central Rift Valley lakes of Ethiopia. And whenever we go out for a field work, we take different types of materials or equipments. And from the list, we never missed GPS. And that's why we set our title as There is no survey without GPS. So during our studies in the Rift Valley area, particularly in Ethiopia, we determine the water chemistry of the lakes including the pollution status in terms of heavy metal and pesticides and characterization of their physicochemical characteristics. And in this case, we use GPS to record or to locate the sampling sites and also the location where point and non-point sources are found. And using this information, we can produce a sampling site, a study area, a map for the study area or the study sites, which our readers can easily understand instead of using word explanation. And also we conducted a vegetation ecology survey in this central Rift Valley of Ethiopia, and we employed GPS for delineating the plots that we are going to sample vegetation. And my colleague Miguel Alvarez and his investigators also conducted a study in the Rift Valley part of Kenya around Lake Baringo on the invasion by prosopis, mainly focusing on its invasion ecology and spatial ecological modeling. And they used the GPS here to show the extent of the invasion and how it will look like, or the trend, how the trend looks like in the future. So in every aspect of our study, there is always GPS. For us, in addition to the GPS, when we go out for a field, we have different types of equipments or materials, like you see on the picture, including the map, camera, and based on our objective or of study or intention of the study, we have also different, we take also different types of sampling, field assessment tools, and sampling equipments. With the GPS, we always have or collect two types of file, waypoints and track points. As you see here in the picture, is a picture from our survey in the central Rift Valley of lakes of Ethiopia, Lake Hawassa. And here the yellow dots represent the plots that we sampled vegetation, that we conducted vegetation surveys and water chemistry analysis, and they are waypoints or marked by the use of GPS. And here the red dots are the track points that we covered during the survey and as well as during our travel or tour in the city to have lunch at different restaurants and also have coffee in different coffee houses. In addition to the X and Y coordinates, the track points may tell us something about the elevation of a particular area or a particular location, and also time we took to cover the tour. And here in the picture, as you see, is a track point taken during a survey in Kenya to Lake Baringo. And in the first picture, you see they traveled from the high area or the mountainous area to the lower Rift Valley where Lake Baringo is located. And from the picture, as you see, you can determine the elevation of the altitude of the area from the track points. And as I said, whenever we go to a field, we have to have a camera in addition to the GPS. And with the camera, we take picture, and this picture, the camera will store the picture together with the time and date that we took the picture. So taking the track points from our GPS and the picture that we took with the camera, we can geotag or georeference pictures using different tools like EXIF tools and GPS Prune, so that we can easily memorize the location, the particular location when we revisit the area, and export this file in the form of a KMZ file, so that we can easily share with our friends to conduct or when we go out for a revisit or to see how they are changing, the places are changing in the future. So the next slides will be presented by my colleague, Miguel Alvarez, and I will give the turn to him.
Thank you, Assefa. So I am presenting also now, which is the common way we use to store the data we collect on the field. And as you have already discussed perhaps in this workshop. So there is, when you start working with special data, independent if you focus on vector or raster data sets, which have been mentioned in the previous presentations. So you will always face like a high diversity of formats that are suitable for sharing this kind of data. So one of the most common, of course, in the case of vector data are the Esri shapefiles, although in my opinion, they are already outdated, but there is also possibilities if you are working in R, with R, so to share also spatial data by using the respective R objects. So here the example of the package SF. And in the case of images, you have also a huge diversity of raster and grid formats. So you have always to get confident on these formats. And R has also a native format for raster datasets. And but once you start working seriously in a big collaborative project, or if you like to collect information that have to be assessed in a broader scale, and combining data from very different sources. So we, at this point, we start always implementing relational databases instead of just loose files. And the advantage of relational databases is that the data keep a certain consistency. So there is a lot of constraints provided by the databases that doesn't allow you to store everything, mix different kind of data, for instance. And usually you have to think very well about the structure of the data to avoid redundancy. So you don't need to store the same information more than once here. And you have in many applications the possibility of connecting this application to a database and use the SQL language to execute queries and extract information from databases. So there is a series, I listed here some of the most common database systems that are also freeware. And those database systems listed here have also extensions, or in the case of MySQL, there is already an implementation of geometry and spatial data types. I also use here mention the example of a database which was also mentioned in the introduction, which is collecting vegetation plot data from African surveys in a big database. Now we have more than 5,500 plots, and this information is relating taxonomy of plants with the locations and properties of the plots and the bibliographic source that we use for collecting this data. And as you see, we have also a huge amount of data which comes from different countries in Africa, and also from different times. So the oldest data record here in this database is from 1937, and the newest one are the current records of own surveys in 2020. When you store the data, as I mentioned, you always have to think about the structure, and here is just like a corner of a big schema in this database I presented. Of course, we also have in the same database information from Africa, but as mentioned, there is also information for South America, specifically also Chile. And we have a taxonomic list, so to know the relationship also between plants. And so there are species that are also mentioned by synonyms. And we also connect this information with a list of bibliographic references, which are the sources or the reference we use either for taxonomy or as a source of data. And this huge amount of and diversity of data cannot be organized in just one table. So here the boxes are indicating very different tables that are connected through these relationships. So, of course, if you think about starting working with such kind of applications, you don't need to start with a very complex database, so you can start with simple schemas. And what we use for visualization of data is almost the same as most of you probably is using for take a look on the data. So, of course, visualization on the one side is for discussion or for you when you start assessing data. So you will always need to have a relationship about to make a relation between the information provided by the data, in our case, the vegetation, and the location. So where is this vegetation observed, or where are specific species occurring? So, and then you come back to the visualization of this data, which can be done in the common desktop applications like ArcGIS. We rather focus on freeware, so we use more Qgis in our team. Of course, sometimes it's also nice to display information in Google Earth, but in that case, we always need to convert to KML or KMZ formats to display this data in Google Earth, but we have the advantage of the satellite imagery, which usually provide a better impression about the situation in the ground. Although also QGIS and ArcGIS nowadays have connectors for some tiles provided by different spatial servers. And there is also the other option of working with R. So in the case of R, we use different packages, like here the SF is the one we use for vector data, the package raster, and there is also these two packages, Leaflet and MapView, which provide a more advanced way to produce some maps that are interactive and can be displayed in home pages. So here's a screenshot of QGIS. Most of you already knows, and as you know, so if you have had the experience of working with R, you know that in R you usually work with command and scripts, so you don't have buttons to execute it. And here I mentioned this example of MapView, which is a package that has some ways to produce automatically some nice maps, interactive maps. So here, just in this piece with 4 command lines, I can produce a map which looks like this. And this is the location. So the dots is the location of vegetation plots collected in Ethiopia. By the way, in this survey, also Stephanie was joining us in the field survey. So, and in the map, if you see, you can zoom in and look for a specific plots. And here you also have different layers activated. So, for instance, I can switch now to satellite imagery. So now I can use this map in the same way as you work in Google Earth, but probably already also in QGIS. Or you have here a topographic map that can also provide different information about the location where we collect the data. So, and of course, if you go more more expert in the use of R and these packages, you may also be able to even improve or do a more fancy map for the display of the data. So, And well, I just mentioned now regarding data assessment, one of the examples. So how we assess spatial data in vegetation ecology, and here more specific in the case of this plant called Prosopis juliflora, which is a shrub or a tree, a woody species originally coming from South America, but nowadays with a pantropical distribution, so you will find everywhere, even in the Caatinga in Brazil, so which is an area where this plant wasn't occurring before. Now is an invasive plant in Kenya, Ethiopia, and Tanzania in the case of Eastern Africa. And you can see here the pictures of the small individuals or shrubs, the flowers here, and the pots. And this plant has also many strategies that make this plant successful when colonizing a new area. And one of those is that those pots, they have a high sugar content, so most of the animals will feed on these pots, like here the goats in Kenya, and then the seeds are able to pass through the tract of these animals and still be germinable. So here you see the droppings of the goats or other animals, and already this Prosopis is germinating from this place. The plant has also the ability of produce a very deep taproot, so to reach groundwater, so to make plants more resistant to drought. And also there is the Qgis ability, so you cut the tree, but the tree is not one die, so this plant resprout again. So, and then when you have this tree in your place, it's very difficult to eradicate this plant. So what we do what we did in Kenya was to do assessment in 72 plots, as displayed here in the map. And as you see, mainly focusing in this area, which is called the Marigat Plains. So here in the Rift Valley, on the eastern and western side, there is a lot of escarpments with just stony ground. This plant cannot grow there. But we collect here information about the species composition and structure of those stands. And we also try to associate this invasion with some environmental information. So climatic models, landscape indices, and some other information taken from the location of roads or the location of original plantations, etc. So the survey was done in 2014, but we revisited some areas, and we plan also to revisit them again to look for the progress or the evolution of this situation.
Miguel, sorry, 3 more minutes, please.
Okay. And here you see, you just see some of those models, regression models we applied here. So comparing, well, here we use logistic and Gaussian models, our regression models displayed here in the curves, and the result is then extrapolate or interpolated here to this map. And as you see here in red, the red areas are the areas where the potential of invasion of this Prosopis is bigger, and is correlated with our observations in the field, where we said, okay, this plant is also confined in these plains. So nowadays we are also trying to do a classification of the area, so by using also satellite imagery to get some clusters that are characterized by different land uses, and also correlated with some geological and soil properties, and which is quite promising to have a better impression about the diversity, diverse conditions that are present in this area. which are not equally affected by prosopis. And well, I just mentioned now directly some take-home messages from our presentation. So the spatial information and the time information is crucial in every step of assessment of data. And nowadays, there is a huge amount of software tools that are accessible for everyone. So with this, I thank you for your attention and also mention some different projects that have been supported research activities in Eastern Africa. And we look also forward to the questions. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks, Miguel. Thanks, Assefa, for this presentation. I personally find it amazing that you can use R for also geospatial data analysis. I've never used it so far for that, but it's definitely quite a powerful tool. I would now invite for the Q&A session for all presenters to turn their cameras on if internet allows it. And because we don't have much time, but I want to start with one general question made by Lucia, and I think it's a very provocative one, and I will read it. To all presenters, a lot of people claim that with advanced remote sensing, there will be no need for field work anymore, at least for biophysical research. What are your thoughts on this? Can remote sensing replace field work entirely? And I just leave it open for whoever wants to jump in.
I think that really depends on whether they're willing to make all satellite imagery freely accessible. Because if you're working with resolutions that are like 200 or 300 meters, that's good. But if you're trying to make your analysis super specific, you need the resolution to be smaller, and those kinds of products are only, you have to pay for them. And if you don't have any funding for your research, that makes the data effectively inaccessible to anybody except people that work for the agencies that provide the data, like NASA or the European Space Agency. So if they were willing to make all of it free, then sure, why not? But I'm not sure that that's going to happen.
I think even if the data gets free, there is a lot of things that you cannot find in images that you find in the places where you go. And for example, I was working with images of 10 meters resolution, and Google has now like 5 meters, I think. And yeah, you can find a lot of things and you can see a lot of things there. But when you go to the field, you find a super different things there and more interesting things. So I think it's quite difficult. But yeah, for sure, for some studies you can replace that, but there is some things that the field is super necessary for the investigations and for the research. For my viewpoint, no, of course.
So my opinion is that it will always depend on the questions you like to answer, and also the scale at which you work. So for very detailed work, we will always need field surveys. And most of the time, so of course, in some aspect, you will have restrictions to access to the place. On also is a financial issue. So how intensive can you work on the field? And when you have to get some compromise, remote sensing can be also a very good tool. Although we don't only work with remote sensing, so we also do GIS assessment of other information, which is not satellite images, like, for instance, landscape, and can help very well to explain, to support the explanation of our results. So now we can, a lot of data, we can only take it in punctual format, so we can just establish plots on the areas where we work. But if we like to have a representation on the surface, then we need always to have a tool to interpolate, and it's better to have the support of such kind of models and some correlations with some indices. So I think it was also mentioned that, for instance, depending on the index that you use, you may have in some situations limitation, no? And in our case, if we like to know the diversity of our area, I think we are not able, or I won't rely on remote sensing to get the number of species that we may have in a place. So we need to go to the field for that.
Thanks so much. Assefa, would you like to?
Of course, similar. In my opinion, and nothing can replace the ground surveying. Even though we have pictures from very high resolution, so it's difficult to know something on the ground. And in my opinion, it's better to supplement combine these two. Remote sensing with ground truthing instead of using only remote sensing.
Yeah, sounds about right. Thanks so much. I have a couple of questions still here from the audience. The first one is to Mateo, and the question is regarding whether you think the analysis that you did could be extended in order to calculate the carbon in various vegetation types, and yeah, whether you think this research can go into that direction.
Yes, of course. Well, the classifications now are done for that with that aim. Like, yeah, you have these more forests, so you have more a sink of carbon there, or more carbon there that in crops or in a deforested area. So of course you can make these kind of assumptions, but yeah, of course, again, you have to be careful, and it's always better to have to have some field data, some data from the field that you can corroborate that in this type of forest you have this kind of carbon flux, and in this other forest you have another carbon flux. So yes, you can, of course, but have to be careful. You have to be careful always.
Great, thanks, Mateo. And the last question, because we are running out of time, is to Virginia. And it is whether you could elaborate more on how you mashed together the different socioeconomic data with different sources and gathering methods. So technically, how did you do it?
Yeah, sorry, mashed is not a very technical term. So the data was, as I said, collected from a lot of different sources, and was all scaled differently. Obviously, some of it was in percentages, some of it was in just raw numbers. So I had to normalize it, which I did using min-max normalization, which is a pretty standard and simplistic normalization technique that was used by Kogan in one of his Nauman, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, in a study that he did that dealt with drought vulnerability. So I decided to apply the same techniques because he'd done it previously. And then I used, in order to aggregate all of these different indicators together to make an index, so to put them all together to have one single number that I could say represents vulnerability in a specific governorate, I used principal component analysis, which is a statistical method that's used when you have a lot of correlated variables that you want to use for example, regressions or statistical analysis. But because they're correlated, you can't use them for normal statistical processes because the correlation would make your analysis unsound. So you use principal component analysis to generate a new set of variables that are uncorrelated but describe the same things. It's statistically speaking, it's fairly complicated to explain, but you can use this technique to generate weights for your variables and then also aggregate it to form an index. You run it in Stata. There is a command that does it for you. All you have to do is know the code, and it generates the index for you essentially. Yeah, that like I could go into more detail and like share the file with you, but obviously I don't think that's necessary. But yeah, that's what the process was.
Thanks so much. Yeah, and I'm sure people can bilaterally contact you in case they want more information about the PCA analysis. Of course. A quick one for Miguel and Assefa. What is a farm plot or a survey plot that you were talking about during the presentation? Sample plot, sorry. Sample plot.
Yeah, I have the vegetation plot. Is a plot is an area of maybe 2 meters by 2 meters where we took the samples for where we determine the number of species and the amount of each species in the area. So whenever we go to a field from a specific, we go to a specific area and we determine a plot, maybe 2 meters by 2 meters, and it's from there that we took the sample.
Thanks so much. And with that last question, I think we can wrap up. I thank so much to all the speakers today for these interesting topics. It's much appreciated that you took the time for being here today. And equally, thank you for all the people that is here attending this event. Feel free to connect to the presenters and with Weltweit and BluoVerda via our social media. And that is good afternoon for everyone, and until the next event. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye, and thank you.
Thanks, Caio.